Um, the Instant Commander is integrally involved in developing an instant action plan. But I'll just go ahead and throw this out right now. If you don't have a planning section chief and you're trying to build an instant action plan, you're not going to have a lot of success, because the actual planning section chief is sort of the master of ceremonies, actually get that plan done and put together. So if you don't have a planning section chief, you basically don't have somebody in there that can shepherd that plan through to completion and be sure that it is printed and done and used. Your planning section chief is actually the person that runs all the meetings. That's the way it is in most teams. Now, there are some teams that vary from that a little bit. Sometimes when you're doing operations work, the teams will allow the operations section chief to run the meeting. And some of the teams, the instant commander will actually say they want to run the meetings. But if you stop and think about it, the instant commander's got so much going on, they're probably not going to be the one running the meeting. So that's the thing that your planning section chief does for you, is they actually take that process on and help to run the meetings. But the instant commander is still involved in those meetings, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about how that works here. All right, so we want to build a written action plan. This is an example of the incident management team working in Washington, Illinois after the tornado up there, building an instant action plan that they could actually use for the search and rescue and some of the response work that was being done there at the scene. And actually what happened at Washington was this team actually transitioned sort of into the recovery side of it too, to help them get some of the planning done they needed for that. So this planning process that we talk about it is a structured process. It is a process that everybody knows what they need to do during that process. It is a process where everybody has a role to fill. And you're going to kind of see the main thing we're going to talk about tonight is the instant commander's role in that. But you can't really talk about the instant commander without stressing some of the other people's roles in there. So we'll kind of bring that up for you too. All right, many of you have seen this. If you've taken any of the 300 and 400 classes, or even the 100 and 200 classes, you've seen the planning P. And this is actually kind of a roadmap that gets you involved in the process of working through this system to get this plan done. Now, we're going to also, you need to understand a concept here. Last night we talked about the instant commander. That was sort of the initial instant commander. That was the person that was on the scene during the first operational period. Now what you're going to see is that as we move into successive operational periods, we're probably going to have somebody else come in and serve as the instant commander, simply because that instant commander that's on the scene is worn out. It's like we said last night, his glycogen supplies are shot. He or she needs to step aside and let somebody else run the show, because they're not going to do a very efficient job while they're in there. Now, you can actually have a whole replacement of the people running the operation. You can replace the whole team, or you can just replace selected parts of the team. Generally speaking, what happens is, like in Montgomery County, we have a team that is an instant response team, an instant management team. So we can go in and kind of do a wholesale replacement of the people that are working at the scene and let them have some time off if we have to do that. The state of Illinois has an instant management team that can do pretty much the same thing, or supplement the team that's on the scene depending on what needs to be done. One of the things that people typically do when they call for an instant management team is they'll say, I want a planning section chief. Well, that's a wonderful thing. The only problem is, what about the rest of the positions? Because the planning section chief's not the only person that's getting overworked. All the rest of those people are putting in doing a yeoman's job as well. So we got to kind of think about that. So what we typically stress as the instant management team is, you're going to bring them in, let them do their work. Okay. So what we're looking at now is, I can kind of show you the cursor here. I think you can all see that. We're going to move from the present operation into a future set of operations where we build an IAP the number of times that we need to do that. When we went to New Orleans, they started building this IAP on about day 6, and they continued building this IAP daily for probably the next 3 to 4 months. Okay. When we did the flooding in Southern Illinois, they built an IAP when they got down there for one of the first days that they actually went to the scene. They continued to build that instant action plan every day for at least the next 2 weeks. And then the locals took it over and continued to build that instant action plan as was needed. Now, did it change a lot every day? That depended on the levee conditions. That depended on if you were getting additional rain. It depended on if you were changing out resources. That depended a lot on what was going on from day to day. So that was how that plan was done. Now, I'll tell you this, in the Taylorville tornado, we built this once, and we tweaked it very little for the next 6 days, because once we started into a process, once the initial search was done, once that was completed, and we started actually moving into more of a recovery phase where damage assessment was the key. Cleaning of debris off roadways was a key. That all sort of started working to that. We built one IAP and we basically modified it as we needed it. So it wasn't like we built a different IAP every day. We kind of built one, and that pretty much got us through the brunt of what we were doing. Now, the second question is this. If you're going to build this IAP and you're going to use this thing from day to day, and you go in there and you tweak it, does that mean that you have to sort of get people up to speed every day with the changes? And the answer is yes, you need to do that, because it may be a change where you are actually moving resources from one place to another, changing what those resources are doing, moving those resources around to consolidate those resources or consolidate command. So you can actually, that can be part of that whole process you would be dealing with too. All right. There are 4 general meetings we're going to talk about tonight: command meeting, CNGS, the planning meeting, and the ops briefing. And the incident commander, again, probably is going to attend these meetings, but that's not necessarily saying that they're going to run those meetings. All right, so that person that's the incident commander, he or she will be attending those meetings. This is part of a sequence. There's a logical sequence that goes along with building this plan, and you can see these meetings are sequential. So we have to do them in order. And that kind of gets us where we need to be in getting this plan done. One of the things that we found when we taught this class around the state of Illinois, we actually went out and did command and general staff training, is that people would start that class on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and they would sit there and go, well, I'm not really sure I buy into the process. And we would tell them, you got to buy into the process. You got to buy into the process. Once you started working it and you let the process help you, then it was sort of, I don't want to say a no-brainer, because it did involve work, it did involve thinking, but once you establish the fact that you set up a sequence of these meetings, things got to be a lot easier for the people when they were doing it. All right, so again, here's the planning P, and the arrows indicate these are the meetings that the incident commander would participate in. In fact, what's going to happen is you're going to see the incident commander engage down here. Now, again, let's think about this. This event started. The response is taking place. The situation is growing or getting more complicated, but the people on the ground are going to handle that initial incident for a period of time. But now we decide we want to bring in some people to assist us, so we bring in this incident management team. That's kind of where we start seeing that incident commander work through this process. So this incident commander will probably replace this person because they've probably been on the job longer than 6 hours, because we say that. But you know darn good and well, when you get on a scene, you have a hard time relinquishing control. So you've probably been there 10 to 12 hours. And so what you need is you need to have this person come in and start working as another incident commander. The beautiful thing about Montgomery County is we've got an incident management team. So we can tap into some of these other departments and bring these people in and let them start helping out and working with the group on the scene and building this IAP and actually start working the event. All right, so what we've got is this present IC, or we got an agency administrator. In Illinois, what we find is the agency administrator usually is not a big participant in working with these incoming command folks to get going. They don't really do that as much as you have the IC, the operations section chief, and the planning section chief will work with those folks. But we have a command meeting, and that's just like to get your feet on the ground, to come in there and say, what's going on? How are things going? What are you planning on doing? What resources are on the scene? What are you doing with them? What kind of success are you having? Is the situation getting better? Is the situation getting worse? I always used to like to talk about incidents and put it sort of in the EMS world. Because in the EMS world, when you start training, what you expect is every time you go see a patient and you provide your skills to that patient, you expect that patient to get better. Well, events are kind of like that too. We expect them to get better. We bring resources in and we're trying to use those resources to do what we need to do. So we want it to get better. But in reality, sometimes we don't have a lot of change or things are still in a progression where they're getting worse. So you kind of have to be realistic when you look at this incident. Do we have enough resources? Are the resources doing the job? Or is the situation still getting worse? When you do river floods, the situation continues to get worse a lot of times. And what you have to do when you build these IAPs is you got to start looking ahead and saying, what if I have to evacuate this levee district? Or what if we have a situation where we have a levee break and we have to evacuate the towns or close the roads? That's something you got to take a look at, because it might not be a situation where you get in there and throw resources at it and all of a sudden everything gets a lot better. All right. So you have to be realistic. This picture you see here is the LA Incident Management team doing an exercise. And they actually had they called them the NEMO teams, or the teams that come in from the FEMA that actually go around and do this around the country. They're the ones that go out and do special series events and all that kind of stuff, came in and trained the Illinois team. And what you got here is members of the Illinois team that are actually participating in one of these meetings, because they're going to be taking over and they're going to actually be doing the job. So we bring these teams in, and what we do is we give them a briefing. And typically the incident commander talks to the incident commander that's on the scene and says, what's going on? What do you need me to do? Where do you think we're going to go? And you ask that person to sort of project. Where do you suspect we're going to be in 12 hours? Now, again, like Greg said, most of the incidents we work in smaller communities, we're not going to have a second operational period. You're probably going to be there 6 to 8 hours, and hopefully by that time, you're going to be in a position where you can demobilize resources and everything can kind of settle down. But there are situations, much as we experienced here in Taylorville with the tornado, that thing wasn't going to be over in 6 to 8 hours. In fact, it wasn't over in 6 to 8 days. And so what we knew was we were going to have to evolve into additional operational periods. And to do that, we were going to build an IAP to kind of help us get through those operational periods. So that's kind of one of the things you're looking to do. If you're an incident commander and you're coming in to relieve me, I want you to be a forward-thinking individual. I want you to sit there and say to yourself, where are we going to be in 12 hours? Where are we going to be in 24 hours? Where are we going to be in 48 hours? If you've dealt with the state of Illinois, one of the things that they're pushing real hard and have for the last few years is when you're ordering resources for the next operational period, the second question they ask you is, okay, you need them for tomorrow. And the question is, how long are you going to need them after that? So that's kind of one of those things that we were dealing with. The thing about COVID was, I mean, going into this mess, nobody really knew how long those resources would be deployed. And probably the truth of the matter is, if you told people this is going to be an operation that goes on for 8 months, probably initially people wouldn't have believed it. But in point of fact, you know, how long are these resources going to be used? Where are we going to be needing those resources at? That's something that initial incident commander's got to talk to the incident commander coming in and saying, I think this is going to go on for a period of 2 or 3 days or whatever the case may be. And you have to be realistic about that. All right. So in this command meeting, one of the things that we share is the operational status and the resources that are being used. The other thing is you kind of have to do a collective look at the resources, because are those resources really the resources you need? Are they really doing the job? Are they being overutilized or underutilized? That's the kind of thing we have to take a look at. In the fire service, when we bring resources in, we're pretty good about figuring out what that resource could do for us and how we want it to be put to use. But we have other resources that we bring in. Sometimes we're not exactly sure what that resource is going to be used for, but we ordered it anyway. And then we have to take a good hard look at it and say, is that resource really doing what we need it to do? Okay. A good example of that is those folks in the law enforcement world, they'll set up a perimeter. But do I really want a police officer standing at a traffic and access control point basically doing nothing for 12 hours? And the answer is no. I really don't. So maybe instead of a police officer standing there, maybe I need a pile of sand, or maybe I need a Jersey barrier, or maybe I need a utility truck or whatever. So you kind of have to take a look at that. Incoming resources may be identified, and you have to sort of, again, look at what are they going to be doing. This is where that 201 comes in. Here's the resources I've got on the scene. Here's what I'm doing with those resources. I'm looking at the 201. They are effective or they're ineffective, and what do we need to really take a look at? So those resources, we kind of have to do an analysis and say, Are they really doing for us what we need for them to do? We did a lot of training in Chicago, and it was always kind of interesting, their perspective on things, because things are so large up there and they're constantly evolving. You have a lot of resources they apply to it. One of the Chicago battalion chiefs basically said that our concept is, are we winning or losing? And that's kind of what we have to take a look at, and that will base what our next resource request will be. If we don't have enough resources there, or we don't have the right resources there, we're losing. And so what we have to do is figure out what we need to do to actually get this thing going. In the fire service, I don't know, how many of you experienced this, but you can get in a situation in some of these smaller communities where you have very large structure fires, and you have to ask yourself the question, am I actually winning this battle? Some of the folks from Pana are on. They had a situation in December before Christmas where they had a very large structure fire downtown. And to be completely honest with you, they handled it perfectly, because what they did was they didn't just start throwing water at the problem. They actually had to decide, where do I want the apparatus positioned? What am I going to try to do with the apparatus when I start flowing water? What am I going to try to achieve in this whole operation? And when the apparatus was put in place and the water was delivered, they got the effect that they wanted to have. Now, they weren't able to save the buildings that were on fire, but they stopped the spread of the fire where they wanted to. They picked their battles, decided where they needed it to be done, and that's how they did it. Working with the wildland folks, that was a very educational experience for us, because when you deal with these big wildland fires, you just don't go battle the fire. You have to know about weather conditions, wind conditions, humidity, all that stuff's got to play into it. So they have to pick their points where they want to stop it. And their famous line always says, don't pick the next ridge, pick the best ridge. And I think that's kind of one of the things we in the non-wildland community and the structural community kind of do certain times too. We got to decide, where are we going to stop traffic to have the best effect? Where are we going to position our apparatus to deliver the water to have the best effect? How many ambulances are we going to need at the scene, and what are we going to do with those ambulances when we get there? Are we going to do triage first before we transport anybody to try to make the most efficient use? That's one of the things that we have to do. The command meeting has this new or this incoming IC, and you have to tell that person, when are you going to take this over? So you're going to go get your crew, and you're going to start working on an instant action plan. Do we expect you to take this over in an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, or are you taking over when you walk out the door? That's something that needs to be looked at very closely, and you kind of have to have a realistic expectation. If you want an IAP built, the shortest we've ever done, I think, an IAP development here in Montgomery County is maybe 2 hours, and we were pushing it. So you kind of have to look at that incoming IC and say, we have to have a realistic view of exactly when you're going to come in and what you're going to do. The other thing is, you might have your safety officer have a list of safety concerns that need to be shared. Do we have collapse hazards that could happen? Do we have a situation where we have a running wildfire and it's not going to be slowed down? Who are we dealing with for resources? What are the availability of those resources? How far do they have to come from? Are we going to cross disciplines to get them? All that stuff needs to play into it, and you kind of got to let this person know what's going on. The incident management team for the state, when we go into an area, that's one of the first questions that the incident commander will ask. Who's your resource providers? What are you getting from them? Are we about to tap that out? Do we have to start looking at something else? We'll talk about that in a minute as well. All right. Delegations of authorities, again, that's not something we see a lot of in Illinois, but if you're bringing in a team to actually work at your incident, one of the things that you might want to do is have a delegation of authority that actually says to them, this is something you're going to be doing. We showed you a picture last night of Metropolis, and we showed you the Illinois Incident Management team there. That's one of the few times the delegation of authority was actually issued by the mayor of that community that said to the incident management team, you're going to be manning this community, you're going to be our command staff, you're going to be the one requesting resources, utilizing resources, and dealing with people, while our people are out trying to take care of their own situations, and get their homes straightened out. Again, the wildland communities perfected this process. Most Illinois jurisdictions do not issue a delegation of authority, but that's something that the incident management team command staff is looking real heavy to try to get to do, because that pretty much lays out exactly what needs to do. There's these one of the things you run into in these instances, if you're going to go in and you're going to help manage that incident, you have to have a really clear view of what it is you're expected to do while you're there. Because what happens is you get this thing called drift, where the next thing you know, you're catching stray dogs or you're doing something else, which was not what you went in there to do. So you kind of got to be careful about incident drift, and you need that delegation of authority, or at least a very clear picture from the people that you're going in to assist. What is it we need help with? Okay. And it sounds simple. You think that's not something that's going to be a problem, but even when you're dealing with, situations in the fire service, that can be kind of tricky when you're dealing with something like that. Okay, once the command meeting is done, a lot of times what will happen is the incident commander that's going to be taken over will walk out of there and have a pretty clear list in their mind of objectives that they think they will be utilizing. When you've done this a couple of times and you look at the 201 and you see on this 201 some of the objectives they've been trying to achieve, maybe that objective is they began a search and rescue operation in the affected area, and you're going to come in and start helping these people out, and you're going to be event plus 6 hours, and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, they're probably going to have that done, or maybe they're not going to have that done. But you can kind of go off those objectives they set up initially, and you can kind of take a look at that and say, we think we're still going to be doing this when this starts. Or you can say to yourself, we're probably going to be in a position where this is not going to be something we're going to have to deal with. It's just something you got to take a look at and say, based on the objectives they developed, how many of these are something we're still going to be looking at? Or maybe there's some objectives we're going to have to utilize that they haven't utilized. Maybe we're actually going to start debris removal on primary routes. Or maybe we're going to have to do some work with liaison with the power company, who's coming in the next day to start removing some of the wires or replacing some of the wires or trying to power up some of the areas. Those are things you got to look at that are going to be something that you're going to be dealing with in the next operational period that maybe they didn't deal with in this first operational period. So not every objective stays the same. Some of them can actually be completed, but there may be objectives you're going to have to add on to that too when you come in and start that work. All right. Objectives are strategic. In other words, what we're trying to say with the objective is, what are we trying to do to bring the situation under control, or to try to mitigate the situation, or to try to bring the situation to a conclusion as quickly as possible. So they have to be kind of overarching. They have to be something that you're going to look at, and they have to be something that you're going to be able to say, I can put resources to it, and I can put a command structure to it. So that's kind of what you want to do with those objectives. I pulled this set of objectives right out of this IS 300 course from FEMA. And what we did over here is we kind of looked at this and said, when would we be developing these objectives? Now, again, when you have a command meeting over here, the incoming incident commander may walk out of that meeting with a very clear set of objectives that they want to bring forth. And so what they're going to do is they're going to take that to their command and general staff or the people that are working with them and say, based on the information I have received, here's some of the objectives I think we're going to be operating with during the next operational period. If you've taken the 300 course, they used a snowstorm. So here are some of the objectives they actually used from the snowstorm scenario that they would actually be using to kind of get an idea of what's going on. No matter what IAP you write or what incident you go with, safety of responders and the public is always in the IAP. It is in every IAP. That is one of the things that we stress very heavily. Objectives have to be action-oriented. Secure a perimeter, provide for search and rescue, provide EMS care. Those things are action-oriented. Continue extinguishment procedures. Contain, implement, provide for, develop, extinguish, establish. What we try to do is we try to build these objectives so that when we put them out there, what we're actually trying to do is we're trying to say, what are we going to do? So for example, if you're dealing with like the grain bin scenario, and you know that you're going to come in, the people that have been there for maybe 4 hours, whatever, 6 hours, but we still haven't got these individuals out of the grain bin. One of the objectives might be is to basically to evacuate the grain out of that bin. Now, that bin we showed you, the picture of that bin was, that thing is, it has several 100,000 bushes of corn in it. So it's not like you pop a valve and the next thing you know, you're done. You're going to have to get, farmers are going to have to come in. You're going to have to get the grain in the trucks. You're going to have to run the trucks out of there. This thing may take a long time. So what you may be doing is coming as an instant commander to take over that second operational period. And your objective may still be to secure, either a rescue or a recovery of the individuals that are in that bin. And then you may have other objectives you're looking at. Continue to evacuate the grain, provide traffic and access control, provide for EMS care. Those are the things you might be looking at. And so those things might be something to stick around for a second operational period. If you're looking at the hazmat incident on the interstate, traffic and access control, that's going to be there from the time you start to the time it's done. That's not going to be an objective that goes away. But one of the objectives might be to support the operations of the local team as they start to evacuate the container. So that may be one of the objectives you're looking for. Okay, tornadoes, search and rescue, establish perimeter, provide shelter. Those are the kind of things that you look at that are going to be overarching objectives that are going to be something that's going to be going on for a period of time. If you take any of the ICS classes, you see this slide. Objectives need to be SMART. They need to be specific. So it's like, what am I actually trying to do? Get the individuals out of the grain bin. They need to be measurable. How do I know when I get the individuals out of the grain bin? The bodies are out, the individuals are out. I know that. You got to be action oriented. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, continue evacuation of grain in an attempt to rescue these individuals, whatever you're doing. That way you get an idea what's happening. You got to be realistic. One of the things about realistic objectives is these things have to be set up and they have to be available. A lot of times, I'll give you a little secret here. If you take the new 300 course and you actually answer some of the questions, they give you certain lists of objectives in there. The right answer is always the objective that's got a time frame tied to it. So it's kind of like, when am I going to do this? So in the tornado event we had here in Taylorville, a perimeter needed to be established. So when could that happen? You had to go to law enforcement. How long is it going to take you to establish a perimeter around the entire area that is secured? We're not letting people in. So that's kind of one of those things you got to take a look at. Or if you're going to conduct search and rescue operations, how long does it take you to conduct search and rescue operations? Those are the things you got to take a look at and you got to be able to answer. And then when you come up with objectives, all right? Here's some objectives. Provide for the safety of responders and public. That's in every IAP I have ever written. Anybody that's taken a class of mine has ever written. Anybody that's ever worked with me has ever written. That goes in every IAP. Establish a perimeter around the tornado damage area by identify the time. Provide EMS care to the affected individuals in the collapsed building. Identify secondary hazards in the affected neighborhoods and label them on a map. Begin preliminary damage assessment in the affected area. Move debris along main roads that are used for supply distribution. Contain waterborne contaminants in the Embraer River. I probably spelled that wrong. So that's kind of one of those things that you take a look at this objective. This has to be an overarching objective. Can you see, if you look at those, that if I have resources on the scene, I can apply resources to every one of those objectives? I have to be able to have the objective set up so that I can tie resources to it. All right, hopefully you're all going yes, because you can. When we develop objectives, one of the things about it, this is kind of one of the, as you take these classes, this is supposed to be one of the, moments where you go, oh, objectives are not hazard based. Objectives are response based. And so what happens is, if you have these objectives like what you see listed here, these hazards that are listed could be hazards where these objectives are applied to, irregardless of what the hazard is or how big the area is. And so one of the things that people start to realize is, once I understand what objectives I have, I'm actually applying these objectives to many different scenarios or hazard situations I get myself into. And you can kind of see that, I think, if you look at those 4 objectives that were put on the slide and you look at the 4 hazards, I think what you can see is that if you have a fire, you might have an evacuation. If you have a school emergency, you're probably going to have an evacuation. If you have loss of utilities at a hospital, you're probably going to have an evacuation. And we all know if we have any kind of hazardous material spill, you're going to have an evacuation. So those objectives are not hazard specific. They're not hazard dependent. Those are objectives that are set up so that they can be applied to many different hazards. All right, and as you go through these, if you ever have the opportunity to take the Command General Staff class or the All Hazard Incident Management Team class, that's one of the things they're going to stress to you. They're going to be talking to you about developing objectives that are non-hazard dependent. We had an incident commander friend of ours who worked the incident command on the fire ground for wildland fire for many years. He had a list of 15 objectives. That's all he ever used in any of those fires. Now, wildland fires, you know, are kind of, if you look at it, I don't want to say every fire is the same because it certainly isn't. It depends on topography, weather conditions, and all that. But when you're dealing with the same type of hazard, a lot of times those objectives will roll right into that. Okay? So, what are objectives? What value do they have for the command and general staff? Okay. So what we want to do if we're an incident commander is we want to share those objectives with our command and general staff because we want this operations section chief to start looking at those objectives and deciding what needs to be done to meet that objective and who could do that. So if the operations section chief sees the objective that says establish a perimeter around the affected area, the operations section chief might say, well, maybe I can talk to my law enforcement folks to help do that. Maybe they can supply resources to do that. Or maybe I go to my public works people that can help us block off roads or do whatever we need to do to establish that perimeter. If you're looking at search and rescue and you're the operations section chief, you're sitting there going, you know, I'm probably going to rely on my fire folks to help me with that. I may be calling in a technical rescue team to help me with that. Those are things that I'm going to start looking at to decide what resources could be applied to that. And a lot of times what you find is when you start looking at it from that perspective, this person, this operations section chief, can start sitting there and saying, well, I know where those are available, so I can start looking at calling them in for the next operational period. All right. Depending on the resource, one of the agencies you have on the scene may be tasked to provide that resource. And if you can't provide that resource with the agency on the scene, guess what? Maybe we need another agency on the scene. So it's kind of one of those things that the objectives are driving this train as to who's going to be able to do something and what they're going to be able to do with the resources that they can provide for us. Okay? All right, operational periods. Operational periods are very important because what we have to kind of do is we have to kind of decide in our operational period how long we're going to have where we implement this IAP and we make it work. I will tell you that in the state of Illinois, when we typically have implemented these, they're either 12 or 24 hours. Now, that's not saying that the staff that's working has to work all 24 hours. You can still have shift changes in these operational periods. But what I want to do is I want to set a time, a forward time, where I can start applying these objectives and making this plan available so it can be used. Okay. So an operational period typically is not something that starts the minute that incident commander walks on the scene. An operational period may start 4 hours from there, 6 hours from there. I can tell you when we built one for the Taylorville tornado, we all walked in the door somewhere around between 6:30 and 7:30 to 8 o'clock. Our IEP didn't start until midnight. So that meant what was going on in the first operational period continued in the first operational period. But in the second operational period, when we started deciding what resources we were going to use, and we looked at those objectives we needed for that operational period, we had to decide what resources we could use and how we were going to start maybe moving some resources around or swapping them out or whatever. So it was very important for us to do that. But we did not start when we came to the Taylorville tornado. When we got there, like I said, between 6 and 8 o'clock that evening, we did not have an instant action plan that we threw on the table and said, let's use this. We had to build it. And it took us till about midnight to build it to actually get the thing operational. But then once we were able to build that IEP and move on, then we were able to utilize that during the successive operational period. So the operational period is a time ahead of where you're at right now, and you have to give yourself time to build that IAP and get those resources lined up. It may be 4 hours ahead of where you're at now. It may be 6 hours ahead of where you're at now. It may be 8 hours of where you're at right now. Depends on the situation, the duration of the incident, and what resources you think you're going to need to bring. All right, exercise 6.